I've been thinking a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder. I recently tweeted the following statement. We need to drop the D in PTSD. There are post-trauma symptoms, but they do not represent a disorder. They are more reflective of a brain that is working properly. The responses were charged with strong feelings. Many people agreed and elaborated on the idea, and many people disagreed and countered the idea. I've certainly learned from the people who disagreed. What I was trying to say with that tweet is that by diagnosing someone with a disorder, we are pathologizing a natural response to an unnatural event. That mental, emotional, and behavioral responses to trauma often make perfect sense given what the person has experienced. The idea that these symptoms are reflective of a brain that is working properly was to suggest that if a fire alarm sounds when there is smoke, that's a good thing, even if you were just cooking. It's adaptive for a brain whose life was threatened to be reactive and vigilant. But as was pointed out in replies to this tweet, some people's fire alarms are going off too often, too loudly, and too long after the fire was extinguished. So I understand how it doesn't make sense to say that a brain continuously sounding the alarm when there is no real threat is working properly. As a Dr. Pamela Hall replied, what seems to be a problem is the looping sensory memory of trauma and the way that the brain keeps responding to a prior danger as if it is currently happening. Another important counterpoint to my statement was from a Dr. Joseph Stanley. He said, not recognizing the disordered functioning equals denied funding to treatments. I would never advocate for anything that would make it harder for people to access treatment. And he's right, that dropping the D would do that. So although I think normal reactions to trauma are often pathologized, given that a diagnosis can make treatment available, I would no longer say that we should drop the D altogether. It's unfortunate that someone needs to be diagnosed with a disorder for insurance companies to pay for trauma recovery support, but for as long as that's the case, I see why the diagnosis is useful. Let's talk about the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, though. Someone who goes by the name Mental Health Master left this comment. I mean, this is like first-year graduate type comprehension. It's just mind-blowing that a, quote, psychologist wouldn't know the definition of disorder, trauma, or the criteria of PTSD, and to top it all off, minimize the experiences of others while doubling down on their, quote, stance. So this guy has a YouTube channel under this name, Mental Health Master, which is great. You should check it out. And I think him and I could be good friends. But I have to pick apart his comment here. Putting quotations around the word psychologist seemed unnecessary. It was as if he was calling into question whether I am one or should be allowed to be one, which just felt odd coming from a self-proclaimed mental health master. But more importantly, to this claim that I don't know the definitions of these terms, you have to realize that definitions of disorder and trauma and the criteria for PTSD have changed with every edition of the DSM. We are not done thinking about what is and isn't a normal response to trauma. PTSD is one of the least stable constructs in the DSM, which says a lot. So this isn't just some concept that you memorize in your first year of graduate school and never think critically about again. To the point that I'm minimizing people's experiences, I can see how my statement could make someone feel that, and I see that it did. I'm learning that for some people, being diagnosed with a disorder is a confirmation of the seriousness of their issue, and it separates it from something that is relatable to most people. I get that, and I'll be more sensitive to this going forward. My intention is quite the opposite. It's to validate people's experiences as they recover and heal from trauma. It's to say, what you're experiencing makes perfect sense given what you went through. Some people feel validated by being diagnosed with a disorder, but there are also people who feel invalidated by being diagnosed with a disorder, who feel that this doctor is saying that there is something wrong with the way I'm dealing with this, or that I'm abnormal. And according to the DSM definition of a disorder, the doctor doing the diagnosing is saying that your reaction is abnormal. It's crucial to understand the difference between mental disorders and physical diseases. Discovering and diagnosing physical diseases is objective. Conceptualizing and diagnosing mental disorders is value-laden. There is significant room for subjective interpretation in determining whether a person has a disorder. According to the DSM-5, which was finalized by the 27 committee members on the DSM-5 task force, a disorder is defined as a dysfunctional behavioral pattern accompanied by clinically significant distress that is not merely an expected response to common life stressors or a culturally sanctioned response to a particular event. As you can hear, there's much room for interpretation here. What exactly do we mean by dysfunctional? Where do we draw the line between clinical and subclinical levels of distress? Who determines which responses to life stressors are expected? And exactly how are we determining what is and isn't culturally sanctioned? If you want to follow this line of thinking further, there are many great resources, and I'll mention the book Critical Thinking in Clinical Assessment and Diagnosis. There's a chapter by Dr. Bruce Thayer that brilliantly dissects and critiques the DSM-5 definition of a mental disorder. Along with many disorders, where we draw the line between what is and isn't PTSD is arbitrary. This condition is not as distinctive as it's made out to be. There's a smooth continuum of reactions to trauma, more or less frequent intrusive memories, more or less persistent distress, more or less avoidance behaviors, more or less vigilance and reactivity. And in the publications of the DSM since 1980, that line separating normal from abnormal has been drawn in different places on this continuum. Full texts of the DSMs are not readily available online for free, although they can be found. But if you'd like a good resource for understanding the changing criteria for PTSD and the changing definition of trauma since 1980, I recommend a paper by Dr. Carol North and colleagues called The Evolution of PTSD Criteria Across the Editions of the DSM. I'll link it below. PTSD has undergone what many disorders have undergone through the editions of the DSM, diagnostic expansion. In the DSM-3, there were 12 symptoms, and you had to meet 4 of them for a diagnosis, and the symptom duration was unspecified. In the 1987 revised DSM-3, as well as in the DSM-4, there were 17 symptoms, and if 6 of them persisted for a month or more, you'd qualify for a diagnosis. In the DSM-5, there are 20 symptoms, and if 6 of them persist beyond 1 month, you can be diagnosed with PTSD. So it is now more likely than it used to be that someone who has been traumatized will be diagnosed with PTSD. The diagnostic criteria have expanded. Some people argue that diagnostic expansion is a good thing, that it reflects discoveries of new symptoms. Some people argue that it is problematic and that diagnostic criteria for mental disorders are creeping too far into the realm of normal human struggles. If diagnostic expansion results in more people being diagnosed and thus gaining access to the support they need, then this is beneficial. There are problems with diagnostic expansion, however. 1, some people are made to feel that something is wrong with them when they're diagnosed with a mental disorder. The message implicit in being diagnosed is that your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are abnormal and problematic. Given the extremely disruptive nature of trauma, saying what thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are or are not normal is quite difficult and will inevitably involve subjective interpretation on the part of the diagnosing physician or clinician. 2, a diagnosis of PTSD can impose a fixed mindset onto people, instilling a belief that they have a disorder, instead of a belief that they are experiencing a process, a healing process. And the diagnostic expansion of PTSD imposes this fixed mindset on a greater number of people and on people whose trauma response is closer to the middle of the bell curve for how we can expect people's healing process to unfold. 3, perhaps the most troublesome problem with diagnostic expansion of PTSD, or any disorder for that matter, is that you create too much diversity within people who have the same diagnosis. Dr. 𝒘𝒊𝒕𝒉 and colleagues examined the heterogeneous nature of categories within the DSM-5 and concluded that these diagnostic labels are scientifically meaningless, and that these diagnoses are made on the basis of internally inconsistent, confused, and contradictory patterns of largely arbitrary criteria. Doctors 𝗖𝗍𝒂𝒍𝒊𝒏𝒈 and Richard Bryant demonstrated that the diagnostic expansion of PTSD increases the amorphous nature of this classification. They actually calculated the number of possible variations of PTSD given the current symptom criteria, which comes out to 636,120. Diagnostic expansion exacerbates the heterogeneity among people with the same diagnosis. This will make it impossible to ever identify consistent neurological profiles for these conditions, and it will make it quite difficult to develop effective, reliable treatments because the condition being treated is becoming less clearly defined. It is important to acknowledge the variety of responses to trauma, but I think we should reconsider what we're deeming normal versus abnormal. I think we need to emphasize positive possible prognoses, and I think we should continue to make the right therapies more readily available to anyone who has experienced trauma, perhaps without even framing their experience as a mental disorder. Trauma is so serious. It's an extremely distressing experience that totally disrupts the person's equilibrium. It makes life feel abnormal, which makes it hard to act normal. Healing takes time, processing, and support. If you've survived trauma, you have my compassion, and I'm inspired by your resilience. And even if you don't feel all that resilient, you're still here, and that's resilient. I've provided a list below of excellent books on healing trauma. Some are long-standing classics and some are new, and all of them are practical and powerful. I'm feeling grateful for the ability to communicate with people on these platforms. I would be honored to hear your story of trauma and healing if you'd like to share it in the comments or in a personal message to me. Thank you.
If you like this video and you want to see more, please subscribe.